Congress will push me to raise taxes, and I'll say no, and I'll say to them, read my lips. No new taxes.
Remember that one? Well, that broken promise could have cost First President Bush a second term. Certainly had something to do with it. But George H.W. Bush, he's got a good reputation for integrity, honesty, service to country, the whole bit. President Trump, not so much. The latest Gallup poll shows only 45% of the people asked say that he keeps his promises. It didn't even say whether they like the promises or not, just that he keeps his promises. Just a couple months ago, going back to February, that number was well over 60%. Now, it's not hard to understand why. The president has had a stunning amount of reversals. Now, let's start with Syria. Here are some of Donald Trump's tweets during the Obama administration. President Obama, do not attack Syria. There is no upside and tremendous downside. Save your powder for another and more important day. Again, to our very foolish leader, do not attack Syria. If you do, many very bad things will happen, and from that fight, the U.S. gets nothing. And again, exclamation point. Just a couple months, though, into his own administration, he ordered the bombing of Syria.
Tonight, I ordered a targeted military strike on the airfield in Syria from where the chemical attack was launched.
That, though, is big time and huge. A similar story with China. Donald Trump, he's been slamming China for years. Here's just a little sample.
They devalue their currency to such an extent. They are the single greatest currency manipulator that's ever been on this planet.
Just, however, a few minutes after meeting with China's president, he reversed course and said China is not manipulating its currency. Never mind. Candidate Trump was also very critical of NATO. Just listen for yourself.
I think NATO is obsolete. NATO was done at a time you had the Soviet Union.
Okay, so no more NATO. Don't need them, don't want them. But after meeting with the head of NATO, well, the president had a different change of mind.
The Secretary General and I had a productive discussion about what more NATO can do in the fight against terrorism. I said it was obsolete. It's no longer obsolete.
Never mind. Also looks like he's reversing course when it comes to NAFTA. Remember the biggest issue? Trade killing the American worker, the guy that he was looking out for. North American Free Trade Agreement. Spent a year and a half saying that Mexico and the agreement that we have with them in Canada, the worst thing going. Here he is as a reminder on the campaign trail.
If they don't agree to a renegotiation, which they might not, because they're so used to having their own way, then I will submit under Article 2205 of the NAFTA agreement that America intends to withdraw from the deal.
But instead of ditching it on day one, now the administration is possibly looking to just tweak it, but they're not talking about getting rid of it by any stretch. He's even inconsistent with something as simple as golf and travel, frequently slamming both President Obama about both. And he also said he would not vacation, and he would rarely even leave the White House because he would be so busy. Just one of the many tweets to articulate that. Trump saying the habitual vacationer, Barack Obama, now in Hawaii. This vacation costing taxpayers $4 million. Let's give a little point of reference. To this point, after only 80-some-odd days, President Trump has left the White House to stay at Mar-a-Lago almost every weekend. And to put a price tag on that, it's costing tens of millions of dollars. And again, he's not even 3 months into his administration. He's also golfs just about every single time he's down in Florida, again, frequently criticizing Obama for golfing too much. But President Trump is on the course far more than his or any other predecessor of his office. And guys, I'm leaving out some of the biggest stuff. I remember about health care, about how as a president here, he was going to do everything possible, pre-existing conditions. He was going to make sure everybody had health care and everything else. He already said, and something that they couldn't even get a vote on, never mind on that as well. Okay, so Dom, listen, we knew what we were going to get, because if you lived in New York and you covered him at all over the years, this is not a surprise by any stretch. But if you're that guy in West Virginia or Ohio or Kentucky or some Rust Belt state here who believed that he was looking out for you, and all the flip-flops on stuff that would matter to you in your vote, theoretically, trade and everything else that he was going to do, he's done a complete about-face. And remember how he was going to be the anti-politician and he was going to, you know, forget the lobbyists and drain the swamp, what I just reported at the beginning of the show. He's going on steroids for what the worst offenders before him would do about how this works in Washington. At what point does it sink in and say, not only is he lying to me, but he screwed me over. This is not helping me. This is helping out his Wall Street buddies.
Unfortunately, Richard, you're correct. But unfortunately, as the professor alluded to earlier, I don't think that it's going to take this one issue is going to really grasp onto him. I hate to put it this way. To answer your question, the president is being a total hypocrite. There's no other way to say it. There's no other way to disguise it. There's no other way to play it up. Richard, he told you during the campaign exactly what he was going to do, and he's done it. Remember when he said early on, I could go on Fifth Avenue and shoot people, and my numbers would still be sky high. Remember when he said that?
But they're not sky high, is my point.
Well, okay, but he's still president for the next 3.5 years. Maybe that's the way I should have addressed it. And who knows, the guy could be reelected. He's pulled a total con. I'm glad you set it up. In terms of, for those of us that's covered him for a very long time, none of this is new. Do what I say, not as I do. As simple as that.
Jeannie, though, where he is historically with his numbers, you have to work at it to be doing this bad in your first 100 days. And again, that poll wasn't if you agreed or liked with what he said, but you believed when he said it, he'd do it. And you had the idea that with him, there was no nuance. He said he was going to do it, and I don't care if you like it or not. Less than half the people think that's him anymore. And to me, that was his biggest selling point. We'll talk about Christie later on the show, but the authenticity part of it. Like, love me, hate me, but you know what you're getting, right? With no political doublespeak. This is as bad as I've ever seen it. And look at the hit, 17 points on this in 2 months.
Yeah, and what you just did in the setup to this would make a perfect campaign commercial. And I think that's where this is really going to hit him, is if, as Dominic mentioned, he decides to run again, which he probably will. You could see this writing itself. You know, it's one thing to run never having held public office and criticize everybody else for what they're doing. But now he is slowly accumulating a record. And the record shows that he says one thing on the campaign trail and he does something else in office. And that may not come back to hit him too hard in the first 100 days or year. You know, his poll numbers are sagging. But when he goes to run for re-election, somebody is going to come out from West Virginia or Ohio or Florida and run for office against him, and they're going to say, this guy is a hypocrite. He can't be trusted. He's not authentic. He doesn't know what he thinks, or he's lying to us, which is worse. And these commercials write themselves.
Andrew, we've been introduced to a lot of new terms in the election season and now. Alternative facts.
Many of them we cannot repeat.
Yes, but but this idea of alternative facts.
Yeah.
Well, we'd sit here and our heads would explode. What by somebody makes something completely up, the press secretary go out and parrot it, they're proven completely wrong, and then they say, well, you have your facts and I have mine. And you're left like, what is going on here? We showed George H.W. Bush and how that no new taxes looks so antiquated and tame in comparison. Is it just him that we're grading him on a curve because we've never seen somebody like this before? Or will other politicians now basically use the same playbook and say, you have your facts, I have mine?
I think we're going to see a whole slew of politicians try that approach. The question is, will they be as effective at it as Trump has been? And Trump is different. I mean, like it or not, Trump is different. And he does get graded on a curve, so it seems. He manages to get away with stuff that no other politician has ever been able to get away with. The volume of the lies that he's told, the reversals that he's had, the negativity, the insults, the crudeness that we've had. I mean, you may start seeing that from other candidates, but it takes a particular skill set, let's say, to pull that off and actually keep winning these elections. And I don't know how many politicians have these skill sets. And by the way, Jeannie touched on something very briefly before. It's not just that he's lying. I don't even think that's the most dangerous part of it. To me, it's that he doesn't actually have any concrete positions. He doesn't care. He will take the positions that he thinks will win him the votes or help him in the moment. He doesn't hold any deep personal convictions. And for a lot of particularly conservative voters who pull the lever for Trump, who hold their own personal convictions and say, this is what dominates the way that I vote. I can't vote for anybody who would allow choice because my heart says life is sacrosanct and I can only vote for candidates who agree with that. The joke's on you because there's no indication that Trump actually feels that way. He just feels that way because it gets him your vote. That's the realization that I'm waiting for, and that's a harder realization to come to, that you've been conned by a con man. It's easier to agree that you've been lied to by somebody. Hard to come to the conclusion that you've been conned to or conned.
And there was a surreal moment last week where there was a lot of reporting that both in Syria and Afghanistan, that basically the military drove his advisors drove the decisions, and yes, he said he agreed to it, but to amplify Andrew's point, the absence of curiosity. Now to me, if you choose to be president, you divest out of any financial complications. It's a privilege, your job here, right? And you don't try and rack up as much to stiff the taxpayer to keep two separate homes simultaneously and everything else. It's just tacky. But beyond tacky, you stay up at night and you read. You're invested in the issues. I'm not so sure it's out of lack of interest or he just doesn't care. But the idea is, I'm actually more comfortable that the Mattises and the rest have more fingerprints on some of these decisions militarily than what the job of the commander-in-chief is. I mean, I never thought I'd say that, because you don't want the military basically making up their own policies here. But to Andrew's point, he has no policy. He has no core belief about anything. And then people fill in the gaps around it, try and change the story so it'll win the news cycle. That's not the way to run a company, let alone a country. I mean, that's the part here, this flip-flopping that I think people, it's not that he's lying, he doesn't care.
And let's not forget, he was a Democrat and an independent and a Republican and everything in between. You know, and the issue of choice, he's gone from one end to the other. The health care bill, does anybody think he even looked at that, let alone read the whole thing? You know, he was going to go with what won. And he thought this would win. He went after it. It didn't win. He threw it away, and he's going to move on to something else. You know, Mexico's going to pay for the wall. They're not paying for the wall. You can just keep going and going and going. And the point is that he doesn't have these firm convictions, so he's able to jump around and try to go for these wins. But at some point, that is going to start to, you have to own that at some point. He can't blame Obama. He can't blame anybody else. He's going to have to own this, and it's not going to be an easy thing to own, even though Donald Trump gets away with a lot. That's going to be tough when you run for re-election.
And to that point, how do Republicans feel, especially if you're an elected Republican, and you can see the midterms in the not too distant future, how do you feel about this person being at the top of your ticket, even if he's not running in 2018? Well, we're asking a New York Republican some of those questions. We're going to have Dom's conversation with Congressman Dan Donovan out of Staten Island straight ahead. And they talk about everything from Trump's taxes to the heroin epidemic.